If you believe these stories must be remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and help keep history alive.
In the winter of 1942, America was a nation still reeling from humiliation. Pearl Harbor had reduced the myth of American invulnerability to smoke, and the U.S. government was frantically searching for any method, no matter how unorthodox, that might strike back at the Japanese homeland. Into this atmosphere of fear, anger, and desperate innovation stepped one of the strangest minds to ever influence U.S. military policy, a Pennsylvania dentist named Lytle S. Adams. He was not a scientist, not a general, not a politician. He was a middle-aged civilian with no experience in weapons development, returning from a leisurely vacation in Mexico. Yet during that trip, he had explored limestone caves filled with millions of Mexican free-tailed bats, swirling in dark, living clouds. The sight of these tiny, fast, maneuverable creatures had stuck with him, not as a natural wonder, but as a latent weapon waiting to be born. Adams believed that bats, capable of carrying small loads and instinctively hiding in buildings, could deliver miniature incendiary bombs into the soft wooden core of Japanese cities. This wasn't just revenge, it was systematized arson by nature itself. The idea was ludicrous on its face, the fever dream of a man outraged by war but untouched by its realities. Yet, if America was desperate, Adams was obsessed. When he returned home, he spent nights at his desk drafting letters, diagrams, and arguments, fueled by equal parts patriotic fury and genuine imagination. He pointed out that Japan's buildings were largely built of wood and paper, an architectural vulnerability he planned to exploit with living delivery systems. In his mind, millions of bats released from a bomb casing would scatter, cling to homes, factories, and warehouses, and then simultaneously ignite entire neighborhoods. A silent swarm of biological saboteurs spreading the kind of inferno aerial bombers could only dream of. But Adams also understood the psychology of wartime bureaucracy. Inventions didn't need to sound reasonable, only effective. And so he framed his proposal not as an eccentric fantasy, but as a scalable solution with strategic potential. He wasn't just pitching a weapon, he was pitching efficiency, surprise, and cheap destruction. America might not have listened to him in peacetime, but in the dark months after Pearl Harbor, with morale low and solutions scarce, a strange idea from a strange man didn't seem insane, it seemed worth considering. The line between genius and madness had never been thinner, and Adams walked it confidently, convinced that millions of tiny wings could change the course of the war.
When Lytle S. Adams mailed his bizarre proposal to the White House, he didn't expect anyone important to even read it, let alone take it seriously. Washington was drowning in outlandish wartime schemes, from death rays to poison fog, and the armed forces were accustomed to ignoring civilian geniuses who thought they had solved global conflict with a sketch and a slogan. Yet Adams' letter, addressed directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, contained a quality that separated it from typical crackpot inventions. It was rooted in an exploitable reality. Japan was extraordinarily vulnerable to fire, its cities a maze of wooden homes packed tightly together, connected by streets narrow enough for flames to leap across with terrifying speed. Adams didn't claim to invent a new explosive or super soldier. He simply proposed a delivery system that weaponized a natural behavior, roosting. Roosevelt, known for his curiosity towards unconventional innovation, took an interest. Even before technical experts reviewed the proposal, the president scrawled a memo that would change the fate of the idea forever. This man is not a nut. It is worth investigating. With a single sentence, the absurd transformed into a federally sanctioned possibility. Adams, a dentist with no military credentials, suddenly found himself ushered into the labyrinth of American wartime research. The war machine moved quickly once Roosevelt endorsed the project. A team was assembled that looked less like a conventional weapons laboratory and more like a scientific circus. Biologists who understood bat physiology, Air Force officers versed in aerial delivery systems, and explosive engineers capable of designing miniature timed incendiaries were placed together under the directive of transforming an animal into a weapon. They were not working on theory. They were tasked with building, testing, and deploying a functional device. And because the idea was so strange, the usual bureaucratic resistance was bypassed. No one knew enough about bats to say the plan was impossible. Funding was secured, facilities requisitioned, field experts recruited. Adams, to his astonishment, was given authority, access, and the backing of the U.S. government. His project wasn't merely tolerated, it was accelerated. At meetings, stern-faced officers and lab-coated researchers debated airflow patterns, hibernation cycles, and the optimal composition of incendiary gels. They were planning a weapon the world had never seen, a bomb filled with live animals, designed not to explode, but to disperse, infiltrate, and ignite. As the war's pressure mounted, the logic driving the project became chillingly simple. If it could burn Japan faster and cheaper than conventional bombing, it was worth doing. And so, under the weight of Roosevelt's curious approval and America's thirst for vengeance, an idea born in a cave in Mexico evolved into a sanctioned military program, one that would soon leave laboratories behind and step into the dangerous realm of real-world experimentation. The U.S. military had funded a lot of unusual weapons, but Project X-ray stood apart because it demanded something scientists were never trained to manage: unpredictable living payloads. To turn a swarm of wild bats into a precision weapon, engineers first needed to solve a sequence of biological and mechanical puzzles. The plan required hundreds of thousands of free-tailed bats, each weighing barely half an ounce, strong enough to carry a small explosive, but small enough to stay unnoticed while roosting in the wooden structures of Japanese cities. Biologists were dispatched to the massive caverns of the American Southwest, where bats swarmed in the millions, a living resource ripe for exploitation. Nets, cages, and refrigerated transport systems were developed to capture and store them. But even with abundant supply, the next challenge was unprecedented: designing a bomb that didn't explode on impact, but instead opened mid-air, scattering living incendiary vectors across urban landscapes. Engineers proposed a massive cluster canister, holding thousands of bats packed into layered trays. Each bat would carry a timed incendiary device, essentially a miniature napalm charge with a delay fuse strapped to its chest. Once dropped from an aircraft, the canister would release at altitude, the bats would awaken from induced hibernation, and then instinctively seek shelter in buildings, attics, and eaves. Minutes later, an entire city would erupt from within. In laboratory discussions, it sounded elegant. In reality, it was a recipe for chaos. Every detail of the weapon's design exposed the gulf between theory and nature. Induced hibernation, for instance, was required to keep the bats dormant during transport and release, but cooling them too much killed them by the thousands, turning weapons into biological waste. Warming them too early caused premature awakening, which triggered panic, escape, and destruction long before the weapon reached its intended target. The incendiary device itself became a separate engineering nightmare. The napalm-based payload needed to be light enough not to impair flight, but heavy enough to ignite structures effectively. Early prototypes used celluloid pacings, which engineers discovered could melt or deform under fluctuating temperatures, altering timing mechanisms and causing unpredictable ignition. To complicate matters further, metal housing was rejected because it interfered with the bat's natural aerodynamics and triggered early detachment. Then there was the ethical absurdity. Engineering harnesses to strap explosives to animals that would surely die carrying them. Some scientists balked. Others rationalized that war had long ago discarded morality. As the prototypes rolled out, the weapon came into terrifying focus. Thousands of hibernating bats, each bearing a firebomb, packed into a mechanical womb. Yet behind the scientific jargon and technical optimism, one truth remained unspoken but understood by everyone involved. When you try to turn nature into a weapon, nature always finds spectacular ways to rebel.
The military selected Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico as the proving ground for Project X-Ray, a desolate stretch of desert where no one would stumble upon the secret nightmares being engineered. At first, the tests resembled controlled scientific experiments, carefully timed drops, calibrated temperatures, and meticulous tracking of bat survival rates. But the moment the first canisters were released, theory shattered against the hard wall of reality. Some bats awakened too early, breaking free of their trays mid-air and scattering wildly. Others never woke at all, plummeting like stones, carrying experimental charges that sometimes detonated on impact. Engineers watched in horror as living components of their weapon defied procedure with the randomness of biology. Soldiers tasked with recovery had to dodge unexploded mini-charges scattered across sand and sagebrush while wrangling terrified animals that alternated between flight, aggression, and sudden death. What was designed to be a surgical, targeted instrument of destruction revealed itself instead as a system driven by variables no human could truly master: weather, instinct, panic, and fear. And nature, in its unpredictable wisdom, seemed determined to remind the military that chaos doesn't follow orders. The disaster peaked during one infamous test, when a group of prematurely awakened bats escaped from the canister, flying straight into the infrastructure of the very base meant to study them. They roosted inside the rafters of hangars, barracks, and fuel storage buildings, precisely the kind of structures they were meant to destroy in Japan. Minutes later, the timed incendiaries activated. Flames erupted with terrifying efficiency, engulfing wooden structures in the same horrifying pattern analysts had predicted for enemy cities. An entire test facility caught fire. Vehicles burned, ammunition cooked off, and emergency crews scrambled in disbelief, battling a weaponized ecosystem they themselves had unleashed. In the aftermath, investigators estimated the damage exceeded what many conventional bombs could have produced. Ironically, the accident validated the project's fundamental premise: that bombs worked too well for comfort. Reports up the chain labeled the incident not as catastrophic failure, but as proof of operational viability. Funding increased, military optimism surged, and behind that optimistic bureaucracy lurked a quiet, unsettling realization. This was a weapon that could spiral beyond the control of its creators. The apocalypse had not just been simulated, it had accidentally begun on American soil.
The shock of the Carlsbad disaster didn't kill the program, it accelerated it. In early 1943, the military officially designated the weapon Project X-ray, a code name that concealed equal parts ambition and unease. For the first time, high-level analysts began calculating the bat bomb not as a bizarre biological experiment, but as a scalable instrument of strategic firepower. Their models used population density maps of Japanese cities, architectural surveys of wooden structures, and simulations of wind patterns, all layered with data gathered from the inferno that Project X-ray had accidentally unleashed on its own testing grounds. The results were staggering. A single cluster bomb of hibernating bats, released at altitude, could theoretically ignite thousands of fires, saturating an urban area with more destructive power than conventional explosives could achieve at many times the cost. And unlike traditional bombs, which destroyed outward from the point of impact, this weapon destroyed inward, creeping into alleys, attics, warehouses, and residential blocks, turning them into ignition points. Analysts predicted a horrifyingly efficient outcome: uncontrollable firestorms with minimal American casualties. The military, already desperate for a low-cost way to bring Japan to its knees, saw in X-ray not a curiosity, but a low-tech, high-impact apocalypse. The weapon didn't need accuracy, finesse, or massive payloads, just patience, gravity, and millions of tiny, unwitting arsonists. To turn predictions into reality, the U.S. conducted dozens of prototype drops, refining both hardware and biology into a terrifying union. Engineers built cylindrical delivery canisters, capable of releasing thousands of bats at altitude, timed so the animals would awaken mid-fall, scatter, and instinctively seek roosts. Each bat carried a cellulose casing filled with napalm, a new incendiary so powerful it clung to surfaces and burned hotter than anything previously deployed. If traditional bombs were blunt instruments of destruction, X-ray was parasitic, relying on living wings to infiltrate the very structures that made Japanese cities vulnerable. Field reports circulated with startling enthusiasm. Enemy infrastructure is inherently flammable. Projected civilian casualties minimal. Success probable with mass deployment. What no one admitted aloud was that success meant turning civilian neighborhoods into ungovernable infernos. Yet, in a war defined by total destruction, morality rarely outran technology. The men building X-ray convinced themselves they weren't designing cruelty, they were engineering efficiency. Every improvement brought them closer to a nightmare that didn't look like a bomb or a battlefield, but a quiet sunrise over Tokyo, broken suddenly by 1,000 small fires blooming in silence. X-ray was no longer just a concept, it was a weapon waiting for its war. The early enthusiasm around Project X-ray slowly transformed into frustration as the complexity of the weapon revealed itself. What had seemed so simple, release hibernating bats at altitude, let them disperse, ignite cities from within, became a logistical nightmare. The timing mechanisms designed to arm the incendiary charges after the bats awoke malfunctioned in cold weather, firing too early or not at all. Transporting live bats proved equally disastrous. They died en masse during flights, overheated in storage, or woke prematurely, escaping from containers before the mission even began. Each failure cost not only time and money, but credibility. Military officials, already juggling higher priority projects and new technologies, grew impatient. A weapon that depended on thousands of tiny animals behaving according to plan suddenly looked less like science and more like cosmic gambling. Administrative chaos compounded technical breakdowns. Responsibility shifted repeatedly, from the Army Air Forces to the Navy, then to the Marine Corps. Each branch tried to impose its own doctrine, testing schedule, and deadlines, only to realize the program resisted conventional military thinking. Engineers demanded more time, officers demanded results. Budgets ballooned, but so did doubts. Leadership turnover erased institutional memory, forcing new commanders to relearn old mistakes. Meanwhile, Japan continued burning, not because of bat bombs, but because of more reliable incendiary raids using B-29s. The urgency of war clashed with the slow pace of biological experimentation. By late 1944, Project X-ray felt less like a revolutionary weapon and more like an eccentric distraction, devouring resources without delivering victory. What had once inspired awe now generated embarrassment, and its champions understood that time was running out.
By mid-1944, the military landscape had shifted dramatically, and Project X-ray found itself competing against technologies that promised instant, decisive results. The United States was pouring enormous resources into the Manhattan Project, a secret initiative so massive it dwarfed every other weapons program in history. Compared to the theoretical power of atomic fire, bats carrying small incendiary charges suddenly felt antiquated, almost comical. Senior officials began to question why they were spending millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours perfecting a biological weapon that might take years to fully develop when a single bomb could one day vaporize an entire city in seconds. The military's appetite for strange, slow, unpredictable ideas evaporated. In an environment where timelines were measured in months, not years, the bat bomb, despite promising early results, could not keep pace. What had once been viewed as innovative now looked painfully inefficient. The official cancellation came abruptly, almost unceremoniously. The Navy, which had assumed control of the program, terminated funding, halted experiments, and ordered the euthanization of thousands of bats that remained in captivity. Millions of dollars vanished into classified files, and the scattered team of scientists, engineers, and officers were reassigned or discharged, carrying nothing with them but a sense of unfinished business. The public never learned about the program. Most participants never spoke of it again. The few surviving documents emphasized failure, glossing over the fact that internal reports estimated it could have caused unprecedented damage if deployed. But history does not reward weapons that almost worked, especially when overshadowed by nuclear breakthroughs. Project X-ray was not defeated by Japan's defenses, technical flaws, or scientific miscalculations. It was defeated by the future, erased by a weapon so powerful it made all others irrelevant.